Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something quite revealing. We're exploring the current state of, well, how people talk to each other online and in public and what that might say about, the collective mood, the zeitgeist.
Exactly. And our source for this is really interesting. It's an article called The Zeitgeist and the Collapse of Civil Discourse. But the article itself is actually based on a YouTube chat between Doug Casey and Matt Smith.
Right, and there's another layer to that chat. It was them reacting to comments they got after Doug was on the Kim Iverson show. So what you're getting here is pretty raw feedback, a direct look at the public's thinking, their emotions, straight from their own comments.
And what Doug and Matt saw in that feedback, well, it paints a picture of this zeitgeist. They found the comments were often, combative, very emotionally driven, and frankly just packed with logical fallacies. They noticed this growing trend, people tending to blame external factors, reacting first and thinking later, if at all. And maybe the most worrying part, a real sense of despair, kind of a hopelessness about the world and their own lives.
So where does that leave us? I mean, this whole thing touches on some really big contentious topics: personal responsibility, economics, family, religion, even the idea of society collapsing, all seen through how people reacted online. Our goal today really is to pull out the key takeaways from all this, give you a clearer view of these undercurrents without you having to sift through it all yourself.
Okay, so one of the first big things that jumped out was what the article termed the attack on libertarian contradictions.
Right.
Viewers went after Doug, who calls himself a libertarian, for living in Uruguay. They called it a welfare state.
Yeah, and that immediately flags this common sort of tension you see online. Doug's response was, well, basically, I don't use any welfare programs there. He said he chose Uruguay for peace, for autonomy, not for its social safety net.
And that specific point, it really shows how criticisms can miss the point, maybe reflecting a limited view of what liberty even means. It also suggests this almost psychological need people have for these gotcha moments.
Like trying to catch someone out.
Exactly. Rather than actually engaging with the substance of the idea. It's almost like accusing a vegan of hypocrisy just for living in a country that eats meat,
Yeah.
regardless of what they eat.
That's a good analogy. It definitely highlights that kind of perceived inconsistency. And speaking of things that trigger reactions, the FDA came up.
Ah, yes.
Doug has this famous line calling the FDA the federal death authority. He argues it causes more harm through regulation and medical mistakes than, say, the Defense Department.
A very strong claim.
Very. And the reaction, both from Kim Iverson and the viewers, was strong too. They wanted centralized protection, from dangerous drugs, a direct clash with Doug's view.
Right, and this really brings up that core question. Personal responsibility versus relying on external authorities. Matt and Doug pushed back hard on this. They argued for more individual accountability, more health literacy.
Taking charge of your own health info.
Precisely. They suggested that maybe people resist this today because of, well, intellectual laziness or even emotional fragility. Doug even brought up Orwell's 2 Minutes of Hate, comparing the reaction to this kind of frenzied, unthinking emotional outburst.
Wow, that's quite the comparison.
It points to this deep desire, maybe for someone else, some authority, to manage risk for us, rather than taking that on ourselves.
So the argument is really about shifting that balance back towards individual accountability. And this idea, seeking external safety nets instead of personal responsibility, it seems like it popped up elsewhere too, maybe, kind of surprisingly, around family and having kids.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big one. A huge number of comments apparently just condemned the whole idea of having children.
Really? Condemned it?
Yeah. The reasons varied. The world's too cruel, or it's irresponsible. Some even said it was evil. Others framed it as just, blindly following tradition or being enslaved by biology.
That sounds bleak.
It's a very significant sign of the times, isn't it?
Yeah.
It reflects that despair we mentioned earlier. Matt, in particular, challenged this directly. He talked about fatherhood not just biologically, but as a moral, a cultural duty.
A responsibility.
Yes, a way to build a positive legacy, something practical and spiritual. And even Doug, who seemed maybe less keen on modern family structures, still saw value in raising, grounded individuals, albeit cautiously, with clear values.
So even with different takes, there's a sense that this rejection of kids points to a wider skepticism about the future, about humanity's place.
Definitely. And maybe taking that skepticism to an extreme, you saw some comments slide into what looked like outright incel ideology.
Ah, that term. Involuntary celibacy, often linked with resentment towards women.
Right. And anti-woman sentiment was definitely there. Claims like women abandoning family life, support for artificial wombs as the only way to, quote, restore fatherhood.
Artificial wombs. Wow.
Yeah. And even personal attacks, accusing Doug and Matt of being out of touch because they apparently married foreigners.
Okay, so how did they respond to that?
Well, they pushed back pretty firmly. Matt argued that a strong, centered man can lead or influence even a woman who seems ideologically lost, as he put it. And Doug defended his wife, pointing out she's highly educated, not some kind of third-world bride stereotype. Their take was that this kind of anti-woman feeling often comes from a place of personal inadequacy, resentment, not some objective truth about gender roles.
So again, it comes back to externalizing blame instead of looking inward.
Seems to be a recurring theme, yes. Blaming external forces for personal struggles.
Which is, let's be honest, an easy pattern to fall into. And that brings us neatly to another classic battleground. Wealth, class, entitlement.
Always a hot topic.
Critics basically dismiss them as rich old men, totally disconnected.
Predictable, maybe.
And Doug's reaction was pretty direct. He basically challenged the commenters, asking why they were poor, asking, do you produce value? Do you have skills?
That's quite blunt.
Yes.
But his point was that resentment towards wealth often ignores self-imposed limits. It's about where you believe control lies, inside yourself or outside. He also talked about admiring a minimalist approach. He famously said, be the Taoist monk on a buffalo.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, the metaphor suggests true wealth isn't about just piling up money. It's about self-sufficiency, minimalism, understanding what you actually need for inner peace, for independence.
Like managing resources wisely.
Exactly. They even put a number on it, suggesting around $10 million, maybe less, is enough for a good life if you manage it well, defining what enough actually looks like.
Interesting. And of course, the boomer blame game came up too, didn't it?
Oh, for sure. Accusations that boomers wrecked the future with debt, got complacent.
And that they escaped America instead of staying and fighting, whatever fighting means in that context. How did Doug and Matt handle that generational finger-pointing?
Well, they sort of acknowledged that, yeah, boomers probably had it pretty good historically, a good hand dealt to them. But they defended their own choices, moving for peace, for economic reasons. More importantly, though, they argued that younger generations today have incredible access to knowledge, to opportunity, mainly because of technology.
So the tools are there.
Right, which loops back again to personal responsibility being key, no matter what generation you're in. They felt generational conflict can often just be a distraction.
A distraction from looking at individual agency, perhaps.
Precisely. Or deeper systemic things that affect everyone.
And then finally, there was this undercurrent of, spiritual confusion, disillusionment?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
You saw it in accusations that Doug lacked a biblical worldview. You saw it in that extreme idea that having kids is somehow an act of hatred towards the unborn.
Hatred toward the unborn, that's intense.
Intense is one word for it. And even, jokes or arguments about which gods rank higher in different religions. Just a general sense of spiritual drift.
So how did they approach that angle?
They mostly took a kind of secular humanist view on it, suggesting religion often tells you more about someone's psychology than about objective truth. Their feeling was that people often use belief systems, whether it's strict dogma or total nihilism, to project their own internal state, their own chaos.
So it reinforces their main point about the public conversation being more emotional than rational.
Exactly. Deeply held personal feelings or anxieties often just steamroll any attempt at reasoned debate.
Yeah. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What are the big takeaways from digging into this comment culture through Doug and Matt's eyes?
Well, first, it seems pretty clear there's a lot of anger out there. Disorientation. Most comments weren't constructive arguments, they were just insults.
Yeah, that's a strong signal.
And second, maybe counterintuitively, hope seems unpopular. Telling people to build families, take charge of their lives, that often got met with scorn, which is quite something. It really is.
Yeah.
And that ties into the third point, this sense that the culture has kind of shifted away from rational debate towards something more like emotional hysteria, driven by feeling alienated, maybe resentful, and definitely fueled by misinformation.
And their ultimate fear, the big conclusion in the article.
It's that we might be heading towards something even worse than war, an existential collapse, not countries collapsing, but meaning itself collapsing.
Wow.
They see public discourse as fundamentally broken. where even basic things like parenthood or self-improvement get attacked, and where blaming other generations is just easier than tackling the real issues.
It's quite a stark conclusion, isn't it? This idea that comment sections are like dream, revealing all these suppressed fears and twisted values.
Like the public subconscious laid bare, showing this widespread crisis of meaning and this reflex to blame everything else for our own challenges.
Yeah.
So given this picture, this philosophical autopsy of Western cultural decay, as the article puts it, and seeing how much public reaction seems driven by emotion, not reason, it really leaves you with a question, doesn't it? How can you, the listener, cultivate that personal responsibility, that clear-eyed view? How do you navigate or maybe even help redefine meaning when the very basis of civil discussion seems to be crumbling?